Hello and welcome to Do Justice. Do Justice is a monthly video conference that looks at the issues of justice and gives examples to inform and inspire the community to also pursue justice. Global Justice is pleased to present this monthly video conference to not only bring together a range of leaders from various sectors, but to also have a range of discussions on how they do justice in a practical way. This month, we are launching the series and featuring leaders from the advocacy community. My name is Sosma Samuel Burnett, and I serve as the founder and president of Global Justice, and I'm so pleased to be sharing this session with you as moderator. Alongside me, I have three tremendous advocacy leaders, and I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce them now. First, we have with us Dr. Nina Balmaceda. Dr. Balmaceda is the founder and president of Peace and Hope International, and she joins us from New York. Welcome, Nina. We also have with us Phil Darke. Phil is the president of Providence World. He's a lawyer, and he is also joining us from California. Welcome, Phil.
Thanks for having me.
Great. And finally, we also have with us Beth Heckel, who is here in Colorado. Beth is the founder and executive director of Think Humanity. Welcome, Beth.
Thank you.
Now, we're so thrilled that all of you are here because you all have inspiring and wonderful stories of how you became these justice advocates. And certainly, we are also going to be looking forward to hearing about your organizations. But let's start with your stories. And actually, I'll start off with Nina. Nina, you have a very unique background coming from Peru and in both academics as well as advocacy. Tell us about your story and how you came to do justice.
Sure. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Yes, I was born and grew up in Lima, Peru, at a very particular time, probably not the happiest moment in history for my country. I grew up during a war. Experts in international relations would not call it a civil war. They would say low-intensity conflict, but the war was very real for the people that suffered. In between 1980 and 2000, Peru experienced one of its worst moments in its Republican history. The effects of the war, I would say, touched every single family in the country, but particularly people in poverty, people in remote areas in the Andes, and especially people of indigenous background. That conflict, as I was a teenager when it was happening, really made me question my faith in what the gospel and the message of Jesus of Nazareth had to contribute, because I was positive that a God that was so real to me, and praise God, he still is very real, had something to say about the horrendous violence affecting Peru. So since very young, I started to look in the Bible for very practical lessons and what does the Lord require of us. I was positive that it could not be just a verbal assent of, yes, I believe in God, and not doing anything about people being killed, genocide having taken place, systematic rape, systematic torture. So as I went to law school, that's my previous life as a human rights lawyer in Peru. I went to law school, and to me, probably one of the most meaningful experiences besides the privilege of being in higher education was joining a group of people who were studying the Bible and who had similar questions, not necessarily the same approach, but certainly taking the Bible seriously about what it means to do justice, to love our neighbor, to stand up for those who suffer. So those years at the university, at the Catholic University of Peru, really were foundational to me. Then the war was over, praise God, and the huge task of building reconciliation in the country became the greatest challenge, a challenge that still exists today. Peru is not a reconciled country, and for sure has remained a very violent country, even though political violence has stopped for the most part. Still, the incidence of violence, especially against most vulnerable people, remains very real. So that's what brought me to the United States for the first time. I wanted to learn about how to contribute to peace building in Peru. And I was able to study at the University of Notre Dame. And I became a student of peace. It was very interesting because I have met during my life many people who study war to end wars, but I felt a lot of inclination not to assume that peace comes just from the end of a war, but that we really need to be very intentional. And that Christians in particular, everybody, of course, every human being in the world, but Christians in particular, have a very high responsibility and a treasure to share, because we do have a message from God that speaks against violence, that speaks against the atrocities that are committed every day in so many countries, and that has not necessarily a recipe or in terms of, follow the formula ABC, but a foundational message for the political community to create an opportunity for building peace. So that's, in a nutshell, my approach to Christianity and the field where I come from. Eventually, the Lord opened doors for us to come to the United States with my family. We're currently based in New York, as Asima mentioned. I must make a small correction. I don't want to take credit for what I have not done. I am not the founder of Peace and Hope. Peace and Hope was founded in 1996 in Peru. I was way too young. But I am honored to serve as president of Peace and Hope International and join my colleagues in my board and the leaders of our field work which takes place now not only in Peru, but also Bolivia, Ecuador, and recently Colombia, Chile, and Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina, so much. And, we're really looking forward to hearing more about Peace and Hope International a little later in the program. But it's just remarkable to see how your circumstances, your education, most of all, your faith has brought you to this place of doing this tremendous work for peace and reconciliation. We'll be speaking more into that in a moment. But I also want to give Phil an opportunity to share his story. So, Phil, you're this lawyer, this California professional, and then now you're working with orphans around the world, in particular in Honduras. How did you get to this point of doing this kind of justice work?
Yeah, it wasn't the plan. It was definitely not what I went to school for. I didn't grow up thinking I was going to do it. God led me to it is the short version. Much longer version, which don't have time for today. But if you're really interested after you hear my short version, you can go to the thinkorphan.com and the About page has a very long version of my story that some people actually want to go listen to. So if you want to do that, you can do that. But the short of it is, I was an attorney. I was working in a law firm, had a couple kids at the time, and I was just really, kind of seeking a way that I could use my legal skills for the kingdom. God just put it on my heart through a book, Desiring God by John Piper. Really just to see my life as worship and what does that mean? What does that look like? And so I started looking into ways I could use my legal skills for kingdom building work. And I came across another book called Good News About Injustice by our mutual friend, Gary Haugen. And it just opened my eyes to the awful atrocities of human trafficking and of the work that IJM is doing to fight against it. And really, I resonated with Gary's story, being a dad, being an attorney, being a man who just was seeking ways to use his legal skills for the kingdom, and that's what God led him to. So I looked to potentially do some pro bono work for IJM, which wasn't needed at the time unless you wanted to go overseas, which my wife and I did not feel led to do. So I started researching trafficking, and really because in 2004, which is when this was all happening in my life, there wasn't a lot about it. You didn't know a lot about it. There wasn't a lot out there talking about what was happening. And so when I started looking more and more into that, I kept seeing the connections with orphaned and vulnerable children, that most of the victims were orphaned and vulnerable children. And, as I've learned more and more about that, about 80% in the US are foster children who are trafficked. And that is just crazy statistics. But when you start looking at that, as an attorney, my mind really went to the root cause. foundational, issues. And I kept seeing that, how can we love these children earlier so that they aren't trafficked, so that they don't have to be rescued? How can we hopefully, train them up, disciple them? How can we find them? How can we really care for them earlier, so that we hopefully can allow them to flourish without the damage, without the needing to be rehabilitated? So that's really kind of what initially got me into this area. Mm-hmm. My wife and I looked into adoption. We actually never ended up adopting, but we had 3 more biological children, so we now have 5. Mm-hmm. So when I was looking into all of this, I was introduced to La Providencia, which is in Honduras, which is the incubator model for the research and everything that we'll talk about later, for Providence World, which is now the organization that I run. But it didn't just happen overnight. It was about 4 years of still working in a law firm, wrestling with, what am I supposed to be doing in this area? And God just really led me to La Providencia, which then caused, I joined the board of La Providencia Providence after I visited in 2006. And then about a year after that, we created a position, a research and development director position, which was really for a legal type mind, analytical mind, which I took, and then ended up leaving the law firm in 2008. And the idea was really to just kind of do the research and development for Providence. But a few months later, the founder and president ended up leaving the ministry, and I took over as president then. And a lot's happened since then. That's just been amazing to see how God has used my legal skills in this space, which has been a lot of fun. So we'll talk more about that later.
Absolutely.
But thanks for having me.
It's going to be really interesting to see, from your story now what goes next and what you're currently doing with Providence. Thank you for sharing that. It's interesting that you also shared that there are individuals that inspired you to this work. And, that's what we want to do, is also be able to use your stories to inspire others. You never know who's going to next be on this broadcast because they heard Nina and Phil and Beth. So I'm looking forward to hearing that too. Beth, you have also a very interesting story. And here you are, this Coloradan who's now working in Uganda. Tell us a little bit about your personal story and how you came to do this work of justice.
There were 3 things that I always think about mostly that are behind all this. And the first is the church I was going to. It was at a ripe time for me, I guess. They asked us all at the end of the service to put our hands out and ask God to put in our hands what he wants us to do with our lives. I was ready to do that. My kids were in their later 20s. I had worked for nonprofits all my life. I was familiar with them, but I didn't know what he had in store and why that I did that. So that was around June maybe. Right after that, my daughter, she's a journalist, went to Uganda to a refugee camp. It's right on the border of Uganda and the Congo, and it's mostly Congolese, Sudanese. There wasn't South Sudan at that time. And I had no contact with her for 10 days. There was no way, and it was I was nervous. But when she got to London, we got a message, I'm alive. So when we picked her up at the airport, she was so excited to tell me about what she learned. She was telling me there was nowhere for children to go to school after primary. There was a problem with malaria. There was no health care, no clean water. There was just all these problems. And she said, but Mom, I know that I told them you'll come back and you'll want to do something about this. And I thought, wow, I guess I better go. It kind of hit my heart. Then right after that, the church invited me and my husband to go to a leadership summit. Most of us have heard of, I think, the leadership summit with Bill Hybels' church. And it was down in Cherry Creek. And the speaker, this was in 2006, was Bono. And him and his wife had gone to Ethiopia. And it was like, I felt like all these 3 things just kind of came together. And before I know it, I'm in Uganda and I see for myself what's going on. And I guess that's the other part of the story I can tell about later, what we're doing. But just real briefly, healthcare, education, socioeconomic development, and clean water. And the one that's really passionate, I'm so passionate about, is girl education.
Mm-hmm.
And that ties in also sort of with the human trafficking issues, early marriages and things. And I'm just loving what I'm doing. After I started 4 years, I quit my job. I do this for free, and everybody working with us are volunteers because we love what we're doing.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Beth. And, we are looking forward to hearing more about the work that you're doing there with Think Humanity. I want to take a few minutes to just reflect on these stories. I'm really caught by the fact that each of you have these themes that have come out, very distinct stories, but some key themes. One is this idea of faith. Your faith has had a tremendous role in developing this, this heart that you have for justice. And then how you've been using your professional skills to do this kind of work. Each of you are trained in these, various areas, business and law and policies, and all of this has been part of your, your journey. And then finally, I also wanted to mention how you've all been affected in some way by seeing directly or indirectly the issues of poverty and the issues of oppression. And those are something that I think we're just going to flesh out more in when you discuss your work. But I'd like you to speak into that a little bit. Any comments that you might have about one another's stories, or about those themes that you might like to share? Phil,
I think Sosima, you hit on something there that's something that we'll talk a little bit about later too, or at least I will. Really, the interconnectedness of all these things, right? You and I have talked about that a lot. That it's not just one thing. It's not like I do orphan care and so we just deal with adoptions and foster care and orphanages. No. It's poverty alleviation and discipleship and family strengthening and church planting and the anti-trafficking work and mentoring. All of it's so interconnected. And it's something that's something I didn't really know ahead of time, but I think that does come from, to go to your other point, of really coming out of legal training. I mean, when you're in law school, one of the things we, the three of us who've been to law, I don't know if you have, Beth, but I know with Nina and Sosima, issue spotting is a huge part of it, right? That most people you don't really think about doing that. But when you are spotting the issues, then you can actually start talking about solutions and everything. But if you don't spot the right issue, you'll never come up with the right response. And I think that when we start seeing those root causes and foundations, so that's something that I've been, it took me a few years to realize, like, God, why'd you even bring me to this? It was this moment of, oh, this makes perfect sense now. All my training, everything that God had done to bring me to that place was for that moment so that I could use those skills in that particular way. And I think that's so much of what has been exciting for me to see.
Absolutely. I think you raised some really great points. I think, themes that we can all resonate with. Another interesting thing, and maybe, Beth and Nina, you could speak to this, that it also is interesting how you've been taken out of your comfort zones. Beth, you never predicted that you'd be doing work in Uganda. I don't know if you want to speak into that a little bit. And Nina, same thing. You're working in some difficult circumstances. So tell me a little bit about how you fell into that.
Okay. I will say first about comfort zones, it's kind of off that topic, but there are two things I said I never would do, and that's speak in front of people and to ask for money. So I always say God has a sense of humor. But you know what, though, when you really, even though you have that fear, you become brave when you believe in a cause, when you want to help people. You can be their voice, and the only way to be their voice is to also be brave and courageous. So that's why I'm able to even speak now for them. But I working in refugee camp, and we also work in villages that are underdeveloped. There have been some situations, of course, that most people would never want to do. It can be very uncomfortable physically. I'm getting older. We've tried to make things a little easier along the way, but just to get to where you're going, and when you're there, the lack of just everything, you know what I mean? Like sometimes we've gone without water 10 days with We've gone without electricity and things like that, where most people don't want to do that. And then we've also had situations where we've had to stay in our room because of certain dangers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I could go into detail, but I don't want to take the time to do it. But there's reasons why we've been in danger. There have been times when once I got in the air, I just was like, thank God. You know, I'm not trying to exaggerate it and make it sound like I'm a martyr. I'm just trying to say
that you're hitting home, you know, the realities of this. And Nina, I'm going to have you speak to this as well. I mean, you're dealing with violence. You're dealing with, you know, situations of conflict and war. And how do you manage that? You know, we're going to talk more about your work, of course, but as a justice advocate, what brought you to these difficult topics?
In my case, probably one of the biggest challenges, the concerns that keeps me on my knees and makes me cry as much as I smile and give thanks for the work that we do, is the safety of our teams. I live in New York. I coordinate with them. I travel and visit them, come back to New York, to my life here, to my work in academia. They stay there where the traffickers are, where the abusers are, where the rapists are, with military that don't respect civilians. So from my perspective, many times I wonder, I mean, I would rather be in the field rather than in the international office. However, like you have said, for now, this is where the Lord has me. But that is my constant search in prayer and in our discussions with our teams, right? A lot of the work of peace and hope has to do confronting not only legal structures of injustice, not that the letter of the law is wrong, although we do have some laws that need to be improved, but it's the practice, right? Yeah. The laws may look great, the constitutions may look good, but nobody respects them. Yeah. My brother from Honduras, I'm sure, has lots of examples about that.
I think we can all resonate with that. You know,
exactly. In our case, in America, that is one very important aspect of practice, but the other one is the culture. And in particular, how a predominant Christian, in quote, / Catholic, although increasingly evangelical as well, but still a culture that condones violence, a culture that thinks of different classes of people, white people over non-white people, males over females or others. So to us, it's that constant challenge. We confront the structure and the practice, but also try to contribute a cultural element and certainly a faith-based element of the plan of God for human.
And bringing passion to that effort, absolutely. You know, we do want to spend some time talking about your work as well. And so, you know, there's so much that you can share about what brought you to this work, but we also want our audience to get to know your work, the meaningfulness of that. I think, Beth, this time I'll have you start. Would you tell us about Think Humanity? Give us a sense of what you do. What does a day-to-day look like? You know, what's the purpose of this particular organization?
Maybe I'll start with what I'm doing this week, or what we are doing this week. We just had a group of young girls graduate from a secondary school. They we started in 2012 with a hostel, and they just are waiting for their exam results right now. However, I'm so proud to say that in an area with 85% unemployment, they're already getting jobs. One is going to be an English teacher. One is teaching an entrepreneurship. One is going to work as an administrative assistant. One's going to be a cook. And it just makes me so happy to know that these girls are going to be successful. So we are in the process. We just interviewed a bunch of new girls to go into this program. Sadly, we see problems with, there was a 12-year-old girl that's parents sat right there, and the mother cried because she did not want her to go to school. She wanted her to get married. She's 12 years old. And so we're seeing situations that are heartbreaking, and they'll probably marry her off to an older man so they can get a cow or something like that in return. And I don't think they understand the value of you educate one of these children. They can help your family. They can help the family for the rest of their life. This is this meal is going to last what, a day or two. And it's just a matter of educating the families as well. But I'm just saying that this is a day-to-day. Right now, we have a list with 20 names. And those girls are going to have their parents visited this week, and in fact, tomorrow. And then we'll bring them in and follow these girls like we are the ones that we just got done with educating, and see what they're going to do. And I remember somebody told me in the beginning, this will not work. This was a man, an Indian man in Uganda working. And he says, a parent is going to come in any day and just take one of the girls and marry them off. But I'm proud to say we did not have one of our students taken by a parent to be married off in the 6 years they were in our program. So I love to prove people wrong when it comes to things like that. There's just, this is the beginning of a school year, and that's why I'm thinking education. But there's other things. At Christmas, we get donations. We have a mail campaign and selling Christmas ornaments made by women in Uganda to get money for mosquito nets. And then we always have large bed net distributions, we call it, and we try to help with malaria.
And Beth, let me ask you a question as you're sharing these programs. So these are all amazing programs. You know, you're educating, you know, these young girls who may not otherwise have opportunities. You're providing these nets and other ways of protecting people against disease. When you think about Think Humanity, you know, that's such a range of things. So tell me a little bit about the central purpose of Think Humanity so people can understand the context for doing these programs.
Okay, this might sound very vague, but our byline is a positive change for refugees and underdeveloped communities in Africa. So our thought was, let's make something positive happen out of all these things. Like I said, it sounds simple, it sounds vague, but we're seeing, like I said, positive things happening. So we do hear heartbreaking stories. I heard one yesterday. We had to send an 8-year-old girl to our clinic. She was sexually assaulted. And, you know, I don't care how long I do this, whether it's been 11 years, these stories break my heart. And I couldn't turn away from this if I tried. So it's just something to me that's really important to do. Help these children, even if it isn't one 8-year-old child in a year. That is enough to me to make a difference.
Your heart is amazing. And, you know, some people might ask, you know, here you are in Colorado, and we understand your story of how you went to Uganda and how you were affected by Uganda. But if someone were to ask you, why Africa? I mean, that's such a big and overwhelming place and context for this work. What would you say to them?
And it's not that I was there that one time. I've been there 20 times. I know this area well. I know the people pretty well. If somebody were to ask me why Africa, God put that on my heart. And when I went there and I listened to the stories from these refugees, you know, like some boys told me how they were child soldiers. Girls told me how they were raped by rebels. I heard these stories. I had to take breaks. I had to be alone in my room for at least 10 minutes before I could go out again. I just needed to build up that strength. And I always just say, when I left that camp, I did not leave. I left a part of my life there, and I could not turn away from this. So if they ask, I can only just say, because I could not turn my back.
That's powerful, Beth. Thank you so much. I'm going to come back a little bit more to the work of Think Humanity in a moment, but I want to also have Phil share a little bit about the work that they're doing at Providence World. Would you unpack that for us, Phil? Tell us a little bit about what Providence is all about, the work that you're doing, and, you know, any highlights.
Yeah, so, you know, again, there's a whole lot more what I'm going to be able to share, but we exist to inspire and equip others to love orphan and vulnerable children and their communities with excellence. And we're doing that in a few different ways. You know, we have a book that we were able to put out a few years ago. It's called In Pursuit of Orphan Excellence. That came from a lot of what I had just mentioned earlier today. It was really just my looking into orphan care and saying, you know, what does it look like to really love the children who don't have parents, don't have families, likely will not be adopted for various reasons in different countries around the world, and who don't have extended family to care for them. How can we love them? Because orphanages, the institutional orphanage model just is not really a long-term solution for these children to really raise them up to flourish, to fully flourish. And so we put together a book that that really created a framework. It's not a model because it's not going to be replicable everywhere in the world the same way, but we purposely use the word framework to say, you know, what are the 9 kind of non-negotiable things that every child needs? What does that look like? And so that book goes through that. And as I talked about, you know, God brought me to this ministry at this time, I believe, for the purpose of, you know, that book really is a good example of how the legal skills that I have are able to be used. Because
and Phil,
as I tell people,
the name of that book is In Pursuit of Orphan Excellence, correct?
Yes, yes, yeah. And it's really just taken all these principles. And I started writing the book myself, and I realized I don't know enough to write this book. I don't have the expertise. And so I got 14 friends who are now friends. Most of them I didn't know before writing the book, to write the book. And they have expertise. And it turned out to be a phenomenal resource that has been used all around the world to help people understand. And I don't say that to pump me up. That's all God saying, you know, I'm going to use this guy who really doesn't know a thing about this stuff to find people who do, because that's what I do well. And, you know, and I love that book has 15 amazing, or 14 other people other than me who are just amazing people who have done amazing work. So, and that book, I spent that much time on that book because that book really goes to a lot of what we're talking about, which is what we're trying to find is a way to help people understand how we can work together, how we can collaborate. A lot of like what you're doing with Global Justice, Sosima, is to say, we know we need more than ourselves to get this work done. How can we actually do that in different ways? And what does that look like? And so when we talk about aspiring, equipping people to do this work and to love these children, it's not us doing it. It's not us telling other people, you need to do everything. No, it's us saying, how can we work together to do this? And so that book is a good example of that. And then we also have
just to expand a bit. You know, collaboration is really a key part of what you're doing and what you're encouraging. And you know, if you can just sort of mention a little bit of both the opportunities and challenges of collaborating on this topic of orphan care, that would be great to hear a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, you know, tremendous opportunities. I mean, I'm part of different groups: World Without Orphans, Christian Alliance for Orphans. You know, the Transform World movement, several different movements that are kind of built-in collaborative tools. But then also, really, I'm just constantly communicating with people on any project that we can do together. I'm just trying to figure out a way that we can work together. And there's a bunch that we don't have time to get into, a lot of them, but it is challenging. It takes time. It takes effort. It's you know, it's like any other friendship you have. I often liken it to, you know, a dating relationship, right? You don't just go into a dating relationship and say, all right, let's get to it and let's go get married. No, you start with hello. You start with, hey, let's go to dinner. Let's just get to know each other. What does that look like? And are we compatible? And you're not compatible with everybody in ministry. You're not going to work together with everyone the same way. But if you look for ways, you know, things you agree on first versus things you disagree on in ways you're different, that's it. That's the start to any recipe for success, is really to say, how can we work together? What do we agree on? What do we have in common? Especially when you're talking about cross-cultural ministry, because we could go to differences immediately and we'd never work with anybody. Or we could say, what do we have in common? And let's go from there. And it is really hard. It takes a long time. But, and like someone talked to me before writing that book and talking about the collaborative nature of it, somebody said, it's going to be like herding cats, Phil. Good luck. You know, and you know what? They were right. It was really hard. But at the end of the day, it was so worth it, because it was, as I tell people, if you work in the team, you're going to create synergies that make it so much better. And it's a lot more fun to work in a team. to
Yes,
have people
absolutely. Well,
encouraging you,
you
to
know,
have people, loving you along the way. And then you create friendships that do last a lifetime because you've
yes,
worked on something
and
that's
what's
meaningful.
interesting about what you're sharing, Phil, is also this idea that you're also, like what Beth shared, taking on a huge topic. When you talk about orphans, orphans are in every single corner of this world.
Yep.
And we have talked about this before, but the idea is that orphans are often the most vulnerable population in the world. And
Right.
so, when someone asks you, how are you taking on this giant topic? And, maybe this is part of your response is that you do it in partnership with others. But, what do you find to be what drives you in doing this work when it is so overwhelming?
It's that we serve a big God. These are God-sized dreams. It's never going to happen if it's up to me. There's no way. And these are legacy visions, right? These are legacy missions that we are a part of. I'm not going to see the end of Orphan and the end of the need for orphan care in my lifetime.
Yeah.
But we can be a part of loving the children that are in front of us to say, how can we care for these kids and how can we help others to do it better? And to see these children not as second rate, not as trash, not as something other than unique children of God who are created with amazing gifts and talents, right? So if I can encourage and equip 5 people to do that better, it's worth it. And the amazing thing is God has given us a platform as Providence. We're this tiny little organization. There's 3 of us here in the United States. And then, as I said, we have our incubator model. So we're doing research around the world. Let me go a bigger picture than that book, because I didn't want to spend that much time on the book. But we are researching orphan care. And when I say orphan care, I'm talking orphan prevention, which is what we talked about earlier today. I'm talking about the orphan restoration, which is anti-trafficking work and mentoring. And when we talk about mentoring, we see that also as preemptive family strengthening, because you're going to take a kid and you're going to teach them and train him or her to be a mother, to be a father, to be a husband and wife. But we're really trying to get people to understand these issues together. And we're able to do that through that research. We have our incubator model in Honduras, which is La Providencia, and that has about another 20 people there, 25 people who are working tirelessly, doing amazing, amazing work. We have family-based orphan care there with family model homes, which is a mom and dad who have taken these kids into their homes and love them as their own. Medical clinic, school, things like that going on there. And we're also able to have a podcast that I'm able to host, interview people from all over the world. It's called Think Orphan. Said earlier, thinkorphan.com is where you can find those. And the amazing thing is of that, I even had just a conversation with a man yesterday who was a senior pastor for years and years, and he ended up leaving that to now train up people all around the world. And he said to me, he called me, he says, I absolutely am thankful for this podcast because I'm able to use it with people all around the world to understand these issues.
Yes, and
so
I was
we're
just
able to harness technology to be able to do that. So
the Orphan podcast is great, and I think that we want to have more and more people have a chance to hear it. I mean, I think it shares a lot about what's happening not only in the work at Providence, but around the world in many other organizations. We're going to come back a little bit more to your work there in a moment, but I want to give Nina an opportunity to also talk about Peace and Hope International. Nina, like the others, huge topic, huge problems, but also huge opportunities. Tell us about this organization, what you do, and how you do it.
Thank you. In 1996, as the war was coming to, well, at the time we didn't know the war was coming to an end, but finally it happened in 2000. 4 law school students got together and founded Peace and Hope in Peru, with the purpose of contributing to building peace and bring reconciliation and standing up for the rights of the victims of the war, victims from both sides, the government and the rebels or terrorists. Since then, we have grown to oppose all kinds of violence. The war is over, but as we looked around, we saw a very violent country. And through our studies and work, we discovered we are not the only one, sadly. Violence is an experience way too common. And like one of my colleagues here said, if you happen to be an orphan, if you happen to be a girl in a poor area, if you happen to be a person of indigenous descent or African descent, if you happen to be particularly poor or without education or without connections, then you are more vulnerable. And this is the reality across Latin America, with certain beautiful exceptions. Probably I could mention most likely Costa Rica or Uruguay as our countries where we have so much to learn from, but everyone else is still fighting a paradigm, a cultural paradigm that has been transmitted through centuries, that teaches that people have different value according to different factors, rather than full equality and the great value of every child, every girl, every boy, every woman, every man created in the image of God. So through our more than 30 programs in 8 countries now, Peace and Hope seeks to confront violence. And like I rather said, we know, unfortunately, we will not see the end of violence, but what we hope to see is that especially Christians and everyone else who wants to collaborate in our crusade against violence, but especially Christians who call in the name of our Holy Lord, can stand up and know what to do in the face of violence, how to use legal structures, especially how to use non-violence to voice their protest against injustice.
Right. Nina, so central to your work seems to be education, really educating people about these issues. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, of how you interrelate and integrate education into your advocacy work.
Yes. Analyzing the root causes of the practice of violence, especially among more vulnerable people, we discovered it has to do a lot with what they learn in high school, what is taught in many churches, unfortunately, what is going from grandparents to parents to children to grandchildren. So one of our methodologies is visiting schools and leading campaigns to teach the children how to discuss with other people with their voice, how to use their words, how to use their ideas, how to learn that we can disagree and still love each other and respect each other as citizens of the same country. That's why we have democracy, and it's about persuasion and may the best argument win, and how popularity is not the same as a sound argument, and how to rediscover each other and stop thinking of the other as an enemy, but as a brother and a sister that deserves to share in the country and the good of God's creation. I wanted to connect something that Phil had said about his experience working with orphans. In our case, we also provide shelter for a very particular type of young person, and it's survivors of sexual abuse. So our shelter, called the Happy House of Good Treatment, has this holistic component. We insist that our girls finish school, whether it's primary, high school. We insist that they have to work really hard because, like Beth was saying, it is not about finding a husband, although we do hope that they will find good husbands and that our boys will find good wives. But it is not about finding a person that will pay for the bills, but to flourish, to develop in all the skills, all the spiritual gifts, all the talents that we have received from God, that we are accountable to God to do the best that we can with what we have and to help each other. So I just would love to report that for more than 200 girls that have spent years with us in the shelter, 4 of them are off to college.
Oh, great. That's wonderful news. Congratulations to them.
Thank you. We are delighted. So it's a very important component.
One of the things I'm struck by with all of your work is how you all interweave the individual and the community. It's interesting to me how you each share the stories of individual, experiences, individual people and their circumstances, but then also set them in a broader community context. I want to see if each of you would speak into that a little bit about, what it means to serve the one while you're also serving the community. I'll sort of open that. Beth, maybe you want to start that off to maybe address that for your work.
Can I say something? Nina made me think about when she talked about how they're teaching how to get along and the violence issues and all. At our hostel, we take girls from 4 different national countries: Rwanda, Sudan, South Sudan now, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and then there's some Ugandans. And these girls have never known each other's groups, and some of them can, you know, when you think of Rwanda and the DRC, have been enemies for many years, and it's passed down from, like you said, grandparents and parents. And so when you bring these girls all together under one roof, and they're together all these years, they realize it starts a new way of thinking. It stops the thinking that this tribe or group is bad, and they become best friends. So I think in a way, at a small level, this is also changing a way of thinking when it comes to violence or learning to get along peacefully. So I'm sorry, so small.
You did a great job of answering the question, actually, Beth, because building those relationships between the individuals actually creates community change. Phil, same thing for you. I mean, there has to be a lot of work that you may do just trying to help the community, the world really, to understand the importance of orphan care and to understand the circumstances behind that. So would you also speak to this issue or question of helping the individual and also helping that community?
Well, I think you have the micro level and the macro level, right? So the micro level at La Providencia in Honduras, to help the individual, child, also helps the community and vice versa. I mean, you need to develop the parents, you need to develop the adults of the community to be able to pour into the children, or else the children will never be able to fully develop. And vice versa, if the children are not developing, the next generation will not be developed, nor will the parents be able to be impacted and influenced by their children and their growth and be able to understand what they can teach them. As we all know, any of us who have children know that our children teach us as much about ourselves than anybody else in the world, I think. And then on the macro level, it really, as I've seen through the book, as I've seen through the podcast, as I've seen through traveling to India and Peru and to Uganda and to South Africa and to, all kinds of other countries, Cambodia, Thailand, different continents, you see the impact that you can have, through technology, but also through individual relationships that an individual can have coming into a community, an individual within a community pouring into that community, and the impact they can have elsewhere around the world. And I think of one little story that Billy Chandwe in Zambia. He is a man. I was able to interview him for the podcast, but he started this little thing in one Sunday at his church. He said, we need to have Orphan Sunday. And he basically did this little thing at a church, a tiny little church in Zambia, less than 100 people, probably less than 50 people. And now there's a global movement called Orphan Sunday because a man came there and said, hey, we got to expand this. And he, he always says, don't ever underestimate the importance of small beginnings, right? And so I think that goes on the macro level, that we being anyone can impact a life that can then impact massive communities, but also the community development is absolutely critical to be able to impact the individual. And I think that goes for the global community as well, right? So we need to have a unified global community that can come together and work to help the individual. And so, and that's something that, again, it works together and it's cyclical. It's a cycle that will continue to perpetuate itself, or it will destroy itself too. If we aren't working together, as I say to people a lot of times, the way I see it in the world, 3 plus 3 can equal 0 if you're not working together, right? If you're, it could be destructive forces. Whereas when you're working together, 3 plus 3 can equal 9 or 27 or what, it is multiplicative exponential growth when you're actually working together. So those are Just kind of one way to
think
answer
those
that.
are some great points, Phil. I really appreciate you sharing that. And I really like what you shared about the 3 + 3 may not always equal 6. It could be 0. The idea of working collaboratively also takes effort. It really means intentionality and cooperation and a willingness to serve, sort of these ends and do it through common grounds. Nina, sort of similar question. Your work, when you talk about violence, that's a broad scale, community and national concern. How do you bring it down to the level of the individual? Because it is individuals that are affected by the conflicts, right?
Right. It's simultaneously individuals and communities, because even if the violence did not hurt me or an immediate relative of mine, it affected someone in my neighborhood, somebody in my classroom, somebody in my school. Peace and Hope is very intentional about strengthening grassroots organizations, women's organizations, and faith-based organizations. So that is actually part of our strategic plan. We are very small in the United States. It's 2 of us part-time. In most of our teams are volunteer, like Beth mentioned as well. So we really need to collaborate and learn from others that have been working in this area before, and also those that are willing to learn with us.
Mm-hmm.
In our case in particular, we have discovered the great power of women's organizations, especially in the prevention of sexual violence against girls. No one like a mother, no one like an older sister to explain things. So we don't want a person that doesn't have any connection or doesn't have any commitment to a particular community to come and teach things. Right. We want the elders in the community, men and women, and especially we have seen great results of getting women organized. Not only as prevention, which is a priority for us, but even in their own lives, they have shared testimonies about how, since they became organized in their own community, the way they relate within their own families, the quality in the opposition to violence, because violence, unfortunately, has been part of their lives forever. Right. Change. So as they are working to learn and to lead others in a path of nonviolence, they are discovering that it's easier for them to oppose violence in their own homes. So that's, to us, a wonderful point. Finding that the power of helping them getting organized.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Nina. I also want, in our few minutes that we have left, to take a few minutes for our audience to understand some of the practicalities of what you do. I get asked some questions more broadly about pursuing justice that you may get asked as well in the work that you do. And one of it is, all of you are here in the United States, you're working overseas. Sometimes people ask, why work in these other far-off locations when we have issues here? And I want to have us address this issue because, especially since you're all advocacy leaders who do the both and, I want to address that a little bit. So maybe, I'm going to ask Phil, maybe you can start us off on this question. How do you address that?
My question back is, what is it about the arbitrary borders that we've created in this world stops us caring about people around the world? Because really, there is a place for nationalism. And I'm not saying that, it's not important to understand where you're from and to be proud of where you're from. Absolutely, there's something to that, and there's loyalty to your country, and there is a place for that. But the fact of the matter is, there's people hurting everywhere. Yes, in your backyard. And my first response to the people is absolutely, there's massive needs in our own backyard. Mm-hmm. So if that's your call and that's where your heart is and that's where you're pulled to do it, because we have massive needs everywhere. There are orphans in our backyard. There are orphans down the street. There are hurting mothers. There are widows. There are orphans. There are homeless people. There are all kinds of people. But most of the people that are asking that question aren't doing anything anywhere. And it's not a condemnation against them. It's just the reality of it. And so those are the two questions. But then the fact of the matter is, the world is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Yeah. And so every country impacts every other country in some way. Absolutely. Whether it's through, the refugee crisis makes it more obvious, when people are literally coming to other countries because they're in such desperate times. But if you ask those people, where would they rather be? They'd rather be in their home country, right? I mean, we learned that. We did a refugee crisis series, and that was the one thing that kept coming up over and over and over again is
Absolutely.
no one wants to go be displaced somewhere else. That's just
right.
no
And
matter
that's a
how
powerful
bad.
example, certainly a powerful example of how, how those borders become a little bit more,
Right.
tenuous.
So-
Nina, anything else you might want to add to that question and how you might respond to that?
Yes. Actually, for Peace and Hope volunteers, it tends to be a wonderful school of how to oppose violence here as well. So we don't see necessarily a disconnection between the work that we do in Latin America with the work that we support here, even though we do not have a field office in the United States. It's more a coordination, international office and fundraising arm for Peace and Hope in Latin America. But as I am very involved in the political processes of the countries where we are serving, I am just as involved here. So when anyone says, why are you asking for contributions for Brazil or for the peace process in Colombia and not here, my response is, these funds are going there because that's where they are needed right now, but I am just as involved in pursuing justice and trying to contribute to a peaceful ministry in the United States where we can talk again about difficult issues without seeing each other as enemies.
Right, and Beth, same question for you. So both Phil and Nina have shared some powerful responses. How would you respond?
Yeah, I've been asked that question, and my answer is probably very similar to what Phil said. But I also think people need to realize, do something. Don't just say, why are you doing that? And if their heart is here to help children with some specific thing, do that, do something. But don't question why people have a heart for something. Maybe, like I said, God puts things on different people's hearts. If God puts it on your heart to help children in your backyard, help them. Yes. But my mission is somewhere else, and I love children here, and I help children here as well. But also, I always think that we are all neighbors. I don't feel like my neighbor is that person like Sosima down the road, or someone just real close by. I think of it as a bigger term. We're all neighbors, and a child is a child. When I hear a story about a child that needs help or an orphan, we work with orphans as well. I don't think first, oh wait, where are they from? Are they from Colorado? Are they from the USA? Or are they from Uganda? Are they from the DRC? I don't think that way. So my answer is usually, to me, a child in need is a child in need. If you wish to help in another area, do that.
Right. Now, we only have a couple of minutes left, but I want to give you all an opportunity to just kind of a last word, if you will. And I'll prompt you with another question, which is, all of you are working on difficult topics. And I think sometimes when people look at the advocacy community, they think, these are so big. What can I do about something so big? When you say, go do that. Well, it's hard when these issues are so overwhelming. So what I'd like to do is close our time with having each of you just share just one brief message of what someone can practically do to pursue justice. Beth, will have you start off this time and work around the circle.
Yeah, I think and maybe this isn't the answer you're looking for, but I think if we look at one child or one person at a time and do something there, that it makes it easier than if you look at the millions that may need help. Like malaria, for example. Look at giving a bed net to that one child and preventing malaria. If you look at the million that get malaria, then it's harder for us to think of that in our heads as easily as to think, educate one child at a time, help the healthcare one child at a time, help one family to learn a skill so they can feed and educate their children. So just think of it in a smaller way and then work from there.
So justice for the one. I like that, Beth. Thank you so much. And then Nina, same thing. Last word. What would you say to someone?
Well, there is nothing that encourages me more than to think that the eternal call to do justice comes from the heart of God. It is not a political statement, although it has political implications, obviously. It is not a denominational article of faith. It's an eternal call to all of humanity. And I think there is a lot of power in distinguishing between charity and justice. Charity sometimes hurts, creates dependency, creates underdevelopment. But doing justice, we open the doors for people to flourish, to grow, and to help each other.
I love that, Nina. It's a call to justice through our faith. And Phil, also, just a brief statement. What would you say in these overwhelming issues and times to someone who's pursuing justice?
Yeah, to piggyback on that, I think it's really to know yourself, to learn, to continually be a lifelong learner, to understand who you are in the context of Scripture, what Scripture says about this, to continually be learning that, to be praying for God to give you guidance. And I know that sounds like it's kind of a little airy and ethereal, but the reality is that everyone's different and everyone has a different call. God calls all of us to this work. But if you're doing it out of guilt, you're doing it out because you think that you're supposed to do it, it's going to be fleeting. It's not going to last. It's not going to be something you're doing with passion. But when you figure out what you're passionate about, then God will make it very clear. I mean, and I'll go back to my story. There's no way I thought I'd be doing this. And God brought me to it because I was learning, because I was listening, because I had people in my life to be able to talk to about it. So I would say do that. And there are millions of ways you could get involved, and it will be clear. And then I will say something that Beth said, and I'll add one little caveat.
We may not be able to do the whole time because unfortunately our time is running short, but we'd love to hear it, Phil.
Just do something with excellence, right? So do something with excellence, and God will direct you how to do that.
And wonderful. Thank you so much. I want to thank you, Nina Balmaceda, Phil Darke, Beth Heckel. Thank you for the tremendous work that you're doing with Peace and Hope International, Providence World, as well as Think Humanity. And thank you for giving us these practical, insightful, and personal reflections to help inspire and inform others to also pursue justice. And to our audience, we thank you so much for joining us. We hope that this has been an enriching time for you. We also invite you to join us online, where we'll share not only the recording of this session, but related resources for you to refer to get to know more about our individual panelists, but also the work of their organizations. And we'll hope you'll join us again next month for our next Do Justice video conference. Thank you.